Emiko, Chapter 1, pages 109 to 122. I had been taught to believe that the American doctors had seen something in my condition that could be treated. Nothing more, nothing less. It was not me they were caring for, but the curious medical condition my skin represented for them. By the age of 15, I was already used to the idea that I was not special, so this knowledge did not disturb me. I was accustomed to the doctors and their tests, and to the whispered taunts that followed me wherever I went. Oni, the other children called me, something like ogre or blackface. I cannot say I blamed them. Ignorance and fear had made them treat me this way. I might even have reacted the same way if the shoe had been on the other foot, but it was not. So I was a young girl chosen because I could be turned into a favorable statistic. For me, the chances were better than for many others. Girls with scars worse than my own were ignored because they were beyond repair. As disfigured as I was, my scars were still within their limited grasp of medicine. I was not far from believing that there was a science to distinguishing who fell within an acceptable limits of ugly and who did not. Yet I never complained. Look at me, I thought to myself. I made it. I was going to America to get my new face. Wasn't that good enough? I was one of the fortunate. I should be thankful, I thought. A person misses a flight, and when the plane crashes into the ocean, she thinks there is more to it than blind luck. Not me. I think sometimes about how I might have turned out if I hadn't been selected as one of the 25 girls to be sent to America for reconstructive surgery. Sometimes, even now, I see myself as an old crone sitting alone at a half-opened, soot-covered window on the outskirts of some dingy Japanese suburb, a lifetime of suppers for one in a cramped one-bedroom apartment chiseled out of the bomb survivor's pension. I think I also knew too well what life held for a woman like the one I had narrowly avoided becoming. The constant invocation of courage had soon become a numbing refrain. This was who we were. We would accept our lot in life. Once beautiful, radiant children, we now were fairy tale monsters, best stoned and run out of our city. The only possibility of escape, the route back into the world, was in the care of men none of us knew and had no reason to trust, who lived and worked their scalpels somewhere on the other side of the ocean. My grandfather, the one person I left behind, told me he'd rarely met a foreigner he felt he could trust in all his many years, not even when, as a young man, he went to England to study medicine, where he'd met many dozens. But he said he trusted even less than those foreign doctors what the future held for a little girl who looked like me. Though that might sound like a terrible thing to say to a 15-year-old, I had lived almost 10 years with that face by then. I understood the truth behind being ugly and in constant pain. No one could look at the scars on my face without being overcome with revulsion. At the time, I hated my grandfather for saying that. I also knew he was right. We were expected to provide the small bodies required for repair, and the time this repair would take, nothing more. We were told to prepare for 18 months. By then, we were used to the pain in our bodies, and what worried me more was being over there. The doctors who had conducted the primary examinations lacked the brusque manners of the Japanese doctors we were familiar with. But I also knew that the special emissaries, and as such, must be kind and respectful. All of Japan was watching them. For a brief time before leaving, we were in the Japanese newspapers. The American doctors spoke respectfully of Japanese medicine and the practitioners who'd cared for us at that point. Careful not to offer offense, they said they made tremendous advances that would be able to help us. But I knew I could not gain a true understanding of the place they came from based on their behavior in our country or what they said in our newspapers. The night I was told I'd been chosen for the program, I lay in bed beside my grandfather in our partially reconstructed home, trying to imagine the new face they would give me. I was still very young and very silly, I know, suddenly fearing that I might end up looking like one of the foreigners who had done this to me. I did not have any firm notion regarding race then, but the thought of becoming like them, with their clumsy size, their aggressiveness, troubled me. I did not want to look different, only how I used to look. I didn't have a clear idea of the nature of the surgery, simply that I was supposed to feel privileged to have been chosen over so many other girls. All I could really be sure of was more pain in my small body, more bandages, and more time in the hospital. During the interviews they conducted after the initial examinations, they had talked of recutting and grafting. They explained what awaited me, but I cannot say I understood clearly. Even to my grandfather's ears, much of what they said in translation was strange sounding, even impossible. These were groundbreaking techniques developed in America, but soon enough words I had never heard before, cicatricial ectropion, split skin grafting, defatting, would become familiar to me, whereas now they seemed as odd and terrible as the monstrous young girls they would be applied to. The foreigners explained to my grandfather and me how they would open up the left eye again, which had been closed by the large, flat keloid scar that had formed rapidly there, and the methods they would use to remove healthy skin from my thigh and the right side of my back to replace the dead skin on my face. I knew nothing about these procedures. What if they rebuilt me in a way they wanted, I wondered, that night, rather than as I wanted? I feared they would turn me into someone else, perhaps for their own purpose. In my mind, I saw myself stepping into another girl's skin, a puffy and pink sort of skin that sagged horribly about the ankles like a baggy pair of pants. I listened to my grandfather snoring through the wall. I wondered if he would recognize me when I came home, or for that matter, if anyone would. That night I imagined my own death. This in itself was not unusual for me. I had often wondered about the place where my parents and brother had gone, and whether it might not be in everyone's best interest for me to hasten my own departure. But that night I went there, actually into the place where I believed them to be, and saw that my parents and little brother did not recognize me when it came time for us to meet. Their ghostly shapes walked blindly past, unable to see their daughter, his sister, with her new American face. For the Obon festival in July, my family had always offered prayers to the recent dead. Now I knew I would never be recognized on that day. It was, I thought, a fate worse than death. I buried my face in the pillow and cried. I could not go through with it. Ugly as I was not prepared to lose what little I had left. What was the chance of meeting up again with my family? The next day I told grandfather of my fear. He thought carefully before speaking, then looked at me squarely. Do you think your parents and your brother would know you now, with a face like that? One of the few things that remained for me before I left for America was the duty I felt toward my grandfather, who seemed to be aging as rapidly as I was growing up. The need to take care of him, despite my own physical limitations, gave me the strongest sense of purpose. With him, I knew what was expected. It was a last piece of my past life. I knew how to prepare his meals and boil his laundry the same way my mother had done. Only I knew how to ease the pain in his knees, which grew more stiff with the arthritis every day. These were the last certainties in my life, as insignificant as they might sound to someone who has not lost so much in so short a time, and without them surely I would have failed to get through those days. I also knew the broken maze of our neighborhood and the one oak tree that had somehow survived near the vegetable stand where my mother used to shop. I knew some of the school children who'd been away from the city on the day the bomb fell on the family plan evacuation. They were the ones who called after me with fear and disgust, Oni, go back to your cave. I knew their names less well than I knew their faces, each just as perfect and beautiful as mine once had been. I was unable to speak with them because of my shame and because of the names they called me. One day I mustered enough courage to attempt to join in the game they were playing, which was called Special Train, after the many spacious railway cars observed for the occupation forces. In Special Train, the girl conductor seated only those pretty enough to board. The group gathered at the base of the small wooden crate she sat on, I was the only girl she would not permit to board. That they would have ended up like me or worse, but for their relatives in the countryside, did not matter to them. I was different from them, and they would never let me forget it. Mostly I knew the other girls in the Red Cross hospital where I stayed before my grandfather came to take me back to what remained of our home. I had dreamed of that day for years, but when it finally came, I was sad to leave the girls I'd come to know as friends. We promised to see one another as often as we could. At first, I visited once a week, but eventually even my grandfather explained, that I would have to move my life forward from this point. Now that I was out in the world again, it was not a good idea to associate with those girls. I should find normal friends, girls like yourself, he said. But I never knew if he truly believed I could ever be normal again, or if he said this simply to lift my confidence. For a short time I was blinded to my condition by his ambition for me. Once I returned to school, my classmates took it upon themselves to remind me definitively that I was not like them and never would be. Those were also things I would always know. There were many other things I had known before the war that in America were no longer of any use to me. I was taken aback by the most mundane of discoveries. To my surprise, there was something here called a washing machine. Even the nightly ritual of knee rubbing, the time I would devote to easing my grandfather's chronic rheumatism, was forgotten. My first host father was a young man in no need of my hot water bottle and strong hands. The same was true of my cooking. The food I prepared on rare occasions for my American family for certain Japanese festivals was consumed politely in small quantities, if at all, then pushed aside. Not even my well-rehearsed sense of gratitude and deference meant much in my new home. Every Sunday I was expected to attend church. The day of our first visit, once everyone had taken his seat, the pastor introduced me to the congregation. My host mother gently nudged me, and I stood briefly and bowed to the assembly. Someone started clapping, which then set off everyone else. I blushed and sank into my seat while my host mother took my hand and smiled, and kissed the good side of my face. I had prepared myself for such demonstrations in public, knew this had not been an attempt to embarrass me. It was meant to welcome me into their community. I was told back in Japan that such displays must be endured if we were to fit in with these people, whether we understood them or not. I was respectful and silent when the pastor spoke, and gave him my full attention. Of course, I could make no sense of his words, but that didn't matter. Afterward, we stood on the front lawn of the Church of the Holy Trinity, accepting everyone's best wishes. Even though I grasped so very little during those first few months, at the worst of times there was always one thing I was sure of, the one advantage I had brought with me, the silence I had perfected and used to protect myself. I did not show pain. I would not show pain. There are forms of discomfort the body grows familiar with, and I recognized them all. By now I knew my damaged skin was as intimately as I did my old, bombed-out neighborhood back home. It was forever scarred and blackened, so that bombing it all over again would hardly make any difference. Somehow it never smelled right, and visitors no longer cared to stop and admire it as they once had. They could punish those old houses and the bruised and scarred little girl living in the deepest and darkest of its basements only so much. Ultimately, it would not make any difference. I would continue on as resolutely as she always had. The world be damned. This silence, this refusal to give in, was my sole tactic in this unknown world. I could not have survived the reconstruction of my face or the enormous tests America presented to me without it. Perhaps I was a strange child. Silence came out of the cracks for me. How can I say this? I saw it everywhere. I saw its shapes in the large elm tree outside the bedroom window of the house of my first host family, of which I had 6 over those 18 months. I saw it pushing purple and black animals through the sky like ghosts from the past. Sometimes it came in the cloud shapes and trees' shadows I stepped over on the sidewalk. Always it appeared as pictures before my eyes. I saw things. I thought this was a consequence of the act of drawing that by then had become for me more a need than a game. Often the quiet came at night, when the refrigerator fell silent and my host's parents went to their bedroom, and I was more alone than I thought I could bear. I would close my eyes and wait for the pounding in my head, balling the bedsheet in my fists, and out from the cracks in the wall, or perhaps through the window that looked over the yard, a silent calm would appear to me, a feeling of peace not rightly my own, and I would sit like an old friend at the edge of the bed and wait there reassuringly until I fell asleep. I learned that I possessed this advantage early on back home, when my brother and I were still in the hospital together. After his death, the silence that fell over the ward threatened to overwhelm me. I had no one to rely on except grandfather, but he could not come and visit at night. And he could not come and visit me now. It was a difficult time to be alone, so I learned to live without fear in the midst of that silence because I realized it would always be there taunting me unless I found some way to welcome it, which finally I did in the form of my drawing. I was like a girl who convinces herself that a cut on her finger doesn't really hurt at all. I found that if I drew it, it went away. If I looked directly into the eyes of the monster under my bed, it too went away. That is how I looked at things in those days because there was nothing else to rely on, especially when the men brought me into the operating room and started putting my face back together. Initially, I did not believe I would ever get my face back. The day we arrived in New York City, I was more doubtful than ever. After our reception at the airport, we boarded a bus and drove down Fifth Avenue, the rain streaking in a diagonal line across the window until the bus came to a stop waiting for a light. Gazing outward in wonder, I touched my head at the slight angle to avoid touching my scar to the cool glass. As the motor fell to a soft rumble, I saw a group of black men, a thing I'd never seen before, standing in a loose circle around a cardboard table. One of these men wore a wool hat with a turned-up ear flaps. Small beads of silver rain sparkled like mercury over the cloth, and I watched with amazement as his dark fingers darted through the air. It was an image of exotic and frightening beauty. He looked in the direction of the bus idling at the intersection, flanked by a police escort. It was simply a glance, not even focused at first, just a movement of the head. Then we locked eyes. In school back home, we were taught about the shameful injustices suffered in America by the poor and the Negro, and I felt certain this was something prophetic about this first encounter. I saw my own fate running parallel to his. I saw his astonishment, the shock in his eyes like a flaring match, and the strange articulation of his facial muscles. I was the object of this surprise, and he was the object of mine. I painted him quickly in my imagination, as if capturing a bird in flight, trying to hold on to that astonishment. His eyes moved over me, and in his own way I knew he was making his own picture of the strange little girl with that dark shadow on her face. The gears ground as the bus started slowly to life again, and the man turned back to his circle. I watched his shoulders, my neck turning with the receding scene until he was gone. Once he was out of sight, I returned my attention to the silver puddles in the street and the bright American flags snapping in the wind as they hung from the building facades, as if it were the bows of ships. Despite our exhaustion, there was much conversation among the girls in the bus that morning. Giddy and nervous, we talked quickly and quietly and called hushed exclamations of surprise to one another. Even though Helen Yokoyama, our interpreter and guardian, had grown up in San Francisco, she seemed encouraged by our curiosity and high spirits and tried to answer what questions she could about this city she'd never lived in. At first I tried to listen to her, but there was too much to see. Earlier that day, our plane had landed at Mitchell Air Force Base on Long Island. I had emerged haggard and groggy along with the 24 other girls, aged between 11 and 22 years, after a 5-day trip from Japan via Wake and Johnston Islands, Hawaii, and San Francisco. Some of us wore scarves to hide our scars. Unsure and shaking in the chill early morning, I wove my fingers together and looked down at the tarmac. I knew only a few words of this language. Already I missed where I had come from, and the only person I had left there. The cameras had gathered around us before we were fully off the plane. We were used to a certain amount of attention. I had expected perhaps the same level of interest on the part of the newspapers as here in Japan, but what greeted us that morning was nothing I could have ever imagined. Dozens of reporters, clustered at the bottom of the gangway, asking questions and taking pictures, their flashbulbs reflecting off the shiny tarmac like lightning bolts. Dr. Barsky and the others from the hospital greeted us all with welcoming handshakes. The reporters continued snapping photographs and hurling questions through the rain as we waited to offer our small hands, questions that Reverend Yasaka, the organizer of the program, attempted to answer. "Why only girls, Reverend?" "The decision was made," he answered. "Is it something Japanese? Are there no boys who need this care in Japan?" "There are many, more than you can imagine." That evening, one of the doctors hosted a reception for the new arrivals. All the Americans were dressed very finely. We wore the second-hand dresses that the Salvation Army had provided for us earlier that day. Unlike the clothing we were used to wearing, these dresses were clean and unripped, and close to the right size for our ages. My first dress was the color of the blue sky with white trim, tracing the hem, and necklines like clouds turning slowly. Turning slowly, I admired it in the mirror in the community center basement. Hardly any of us could remember the last time we'd seen clothing this pretty. But Sachiko, one of the younger girls, had unknowingly been given a dress with polka dots, whose polka dots mirrored the scars on her body. She became upset and began to cry as she stood in front of the mirror I was sharing with her. We exchanged dresses, and though the new one didn't fit as well as the blue dress, I was happy to have it. Before that night, I had never seen rich people. All 25 of us stood at one side of the room and waited to be told what to do. Some of the women, even those with long gloves pulled to the elbow, tried to talk with us through Reverend Yasaka or Helen Yakoyama. One woman pointed to me with her eyes more than anything else through the crowd of cocktail drinkers. She smiled as if an idea had just popped into her head. I had seen her talking with the Reverend and Bernard Simon, a surgeon from Mount Sinai who had volunteered his services to the project. I lowered my eyes, as was natural for a girl to do, and afraid that I somehow had offended the woman. I wondered if she'd noticed that my dress, too small, made me look large and awkward, and my figure prematurely developed. I attempted to wish away the interest she seemed to have taken in me, but in a moment they were at my side and she began to speak. She had large teeth and blonde hair, very beautiful, I thought. She was polite enough to look directly into my good eye. I was fearful, though, having no idea why she found me of any interest. With the help of the Reverend, she began by asking me about our journey to America. Do you like America? I have not had much opportunity to see America, I said after her question was translated for me. But do you like America? Americans? I smiled and nodded, as I had been told to do when I didn't know how to answer a question. Do you know what television is? Yes, I nodded. Have you ever seen television? No. Not back home either, she asked. I'm sorry. She touched my shoulder lightly and smiled, and she turned and walked away. The next morning, the Reverend and Helen came to the hotel and told me there was a TV program in Los Angeles that was interested in our story. I asked why these people should like to know the story of a group of deformed and hideous ugly girls. I was sitting on my bed. He sat beside me. Don't talk like that, Emiko, he said. Show respect. The Americans can be people of compassion. They can be like us. Many of them regret what has happened. Almost 10 years have passed now. There are people who want to help ensure that the bomb will never be used again. But it was used, I said. Yes, it was. But we can help show people that it is a terrible weapon. We can show people what it does. I said nothing. They want to help us, he said, by raising money that will be used during our stay. They will give us the opportunity to tell America our story. Once our story is told, they will never use the bomb again. Takako has already agreed. Takako had sat next to me on the plane, and we'd shared a room during our stopover in Hawaii. She'd been visiting relatives in Hiroshima when they dropped the bomb on us. I liked her, and thought she would be a good person to visit Los Angeles with, despite the bad leg which forced her to walk at an exceedingly slow pace, and to sit and rest often. Although the surgeons could do nothing about her smashed leg, I envied Takako for the fundamental difference between us. She had gone alone to visit her uncle and aunt in Hiroshima, which meant her parents were still alive in her hometown, and when I considered, I decided I would give up both legs, not just one, for the same to be true for me. Yes, I said, bowing. I will help. I didn't know how far away Los Angeles was, on the other side of the country, back in the direction we'd just traveled. I was 16 now, though severely scarred. I had still had the same energy and boundless curiosity of any girl that age. By then, the burns on my face and back did not limit my freedom of movement. Of course, I could smile only out of one side of my mouth, but my general mobility had not been affected. There was a time when such a long trip was a small sacrifice in exchange for television. Although I knew only a few words of English, learned from my grandfather who had picked up some of the language during his stay in England, and from the post-war radio program called Kamu Kamu Igo, I believed this might be the reason I was chosen. We were mostly uneducated girls with no foreign languages or particular skills between us, myself included. I had touched the real ocean, not just the bay on which my hometown was situated, only once before in my life, barely 4 days before, on our stopover in Hawaii. However excited I was at the prospect of doing so again, I chose not to reveal this because I knew that the trip was considered an important job, though I did not yet have a clear picture of what it entailed, and that it must not be sidetracked by a young girl's whim to gaze upon the ocean that was her link to home. The day we landed in Los Angeles was beautiful and warm, unlike the one we'd left behind in New York. A man from the television show greeted us at the arrival gate, holding a cardboard sign spelling out Yasaka. Without acknowledging me or Takako, he shook the Reverend's hand and tipped his hat to Helen, then led us to his car. I couldn't understand any of the conversation he carried on with the Reverend or Helen. Instead, I watched the gray highway and the speeding new cars driving on either side of us and wondered, where were the Japanese my grandfather had told me about? Those who tried to convince the people here not to harm our city. It seemed now that those people had been no more than an invention of his imagination. I asked no questions because none were asked of me. It was during that ride, however, that Takako and I began to guess something more regarding our involvement here. We had been invited in order to help raise money for our stay in America, but exactly what our role should be was yet to be explained to us. Helen sat in the back seat with us, leaning forward slightly as she listened to the Reverend and the driver speaking. Occasionally, the driver looked at me and Takako in his rearview mirror. His smile was embarrassed and uncomfortable. We sat quietly with our hands in our laps, barely able to contain myself. I shuffled my feet on the floorboards and fiddled nervously with the pleats in my dress. I raised my eyes from time to time and saw the flash of the driver's teeth in the mirror and his pink cheeks bouncing in time to the bumps in the hard road beneath us, and the cars speeding past outside the windows. I wondered if his eyes could tell anything more. He spoke very quickly. I thought even Helen, who was from here, might have difficulty understanding him. Takako and I exchanged glasses. Enough of that, Helen said. We will be there soon. I still did not have a clear understanding of just where it was we were going. I could see Takako was as eager as I was. We smiled and rolled our eyes and shook our heads, staring into our laps, still full of disbelief. We could not comprehend the gravity of what was slowly dawning on us. After Helen returned her attention to the conversation in the front seat, Takako spoke behind her back in a whisper, but I understood perfectly. I shook my head with clip motion that was meant not to be detectable by the adults. No, not us. They would not put such ogres as us on the television.